When I say the words sexual revolution, what comes to mind? Dirty hippies? Woodstock? Nuns in pantsuits lecturing us about politics, while being rumored to practice literal witchcraft? How about single mothers and deadbeat dads? All of the above? If so, that's only scratching the surface. What I'm about to present certainly isn't the end-all be-all of what the sexual revolution has wrought, nor a full-fledged academic investigation into its origins, but something that will attempt to give people a better idea of where the sexual revolution came from and what it has wrought. This has become relevant today because people across the ideological and religious spectrums are coming to a consensus that the sexual revolution was not all it was cracked up to be. What that growing consensus will lead to is anyone's guess, but hopefully it will be better than the rampant degeneracy we see on full display today. On to our topic. In an opinion piece in the Catholic Herald, writer C.C. Pecknold writes that progressive commentators are starting to admit that the sexual revolution was a failure. The opinion piece is worth reading. Mr. Pecknold was writing in response to a feminist writer, saying that the rise of involuntary celibacy was a sign of progress, for the sexual revolution had wrought a monstrous world where sexual permissiveness permitted the normalization of sexual assault. While I would dispute that sexual assault has been normalized, sexual brutality and the commodification of the marital act has become normalized, and the end result is the same whether you believe in a rape culture like feminists usually do, or not. We now live in an increasingly atomized culture where the people are separated from God, utterly alienated from our neighbors, and medicating this alienation with sexual depravity, consumerism, and drug abuse. The marital act has become just another commodity to be traded or used for entertainment and even education. The sexual revolution had the same effect on human sexuality that the Protestant revolt had on Christian worship. The sacred has been all but destroyed, with the ends of the practice divorced from its exercise, with the focus now on feelings and entertainment and not on the sacred nature of the act. Mr. Pecknold was responding to Yvonne Roberts, writing in The Guardian, a secular leftist newspaper out of London. In her piece, Miss Roberts writes, and I quote, "Are we satiated? As a commodity, is junk sex now on the wane, like shopping on High Street? Are the young beginning to recalibrate sex and also understand it is invaluable connection with intimacy, social skills, self-awareness, and mutual self-respect?" End quote. To that, there are signs that the answer is, in fact, yes, but that isn't far enough. Mr. Pecknold rightfully says that hopefully the next step will be the recognition of the sacred nature of human sexuality, and that its only place is in the sacred space of the marital life between a man and a woman, and nowhere else. While we hear that younger people are often moving towards the right politically, what we really see is that younger people seem more libertarian, which is not conservative in the classical sense, but also more reserved about the sexual side of the human experience, meaning that they aren't sleeping around nearly as much as people just a few years older than them. They still don't have a lot of the more conservative and traditional sexual moral hang-ups, though. But all that is a sign of hope, but there is no sign of a great religious awakening among young people across the West, save for young Catholics who want to stay in the church and cling to the faith, and how they seem to be near universally moving to the traditional Latin Mass for the traditional worship and traditional faith being offered, but they represent an extreme minority in the broader society. Miss Roberts describes the 1960s in a surprisingly honest way for someone that I wouldn't expect it from, quoting her take in The Guardian, and I quote, "In How Was It For You? Women, Sex, Love, and Power in the 1960s, published last month, the writer Virginia Nicholson charts this period, including the cumulative impact of the pill, unhitching sex from reproduction, and the explosion of anti-authoritarian youthful optimism, female aspirations, and working-class talent in fashion, music, books, and film. Women's liberation was also bubbling up, but still, in the allegedly egalitarian swinging 60s, the late writer Jenny Diskey told Nicholson, 'I was raped several times by men who arrived in my bed and wouldn't take no for an answer.' The sexual liberation liberated a generation, Nicholson writes, but men most of all. So how, last week, did we arrive at the conundrum of young male celibacy? End quote. Whenever I encounter young women vociferously defending abortion and contraception, they invariably claim that those of us who defend life, traditional gender norms, and traditional marriage want to control women's bodies. Far from it. The response that usually leaves the young feminist without a strong answer is similar to what Miss Roberts said in what I just quoted, that the pill and abortion empowered men, not women. The birth control pill, ironically named for, as Chesterton said, it promotes neither birth nor control, enabled men to embrace the worst parts of our natures, and to enable men to lose our most noble feature, that expression of love that only comes with commitment. Men were able to trade commitment for flight and fancy, both features being essential to the life of the perpetual child. Coupled with sexual activity, this becomes an extremely dangerous condition for society to embrace, yet we've embraced it. I'm not suggesting that women are the real victims of the sexual revolution, far from it, though that seems to be Miss Roberts' thesis. Rather, the harmony between men and women is the real victim, and especially that single greatest fruit of the harmony, the family, is the greatest victim of the aptly named sexual revolution. The question that is rarely asked is who benefited from the sexual revolution from the start. And when it is asked, that answer is usually what I gave you, either men or maybe the drug companies. But this goes way deeper than that answer. To that we need to look to who promoted the sexual revolution, where it came from, and how it managed to explode in the 1960s. After all, simply introducing the pill in the 1960s was not enough by itself to fundamentally transform society. The truth is that the roots of the sexual revolution can be traced back at least a half a century before, to World War I, if not earlier. In a 1926 article in his magazine GK's Weekly, G.K. Chesterton said this about the next social revolution. Quote, "The next great heresy is going to be simply an attack on morality, and especially on sexual morality. And it is coming not from a few socialists surviving from the Fabian Society, but from the living exultant energy of the rich, resolved to enjoy themselves at last, with neither popery nor puritanism nor socialism to hold them back. The roots of the new heresy, God knows, are as deep as nature itself, whose flower is the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eye and the pride of life. I say that the man who cannot see this cannot see the signs of the times, cannot see even the sky signs in the streets that are the new sort of signs in heaven. The madness of tomorrow is not in Moscow, but much more in Manhattan. But most of what was in Broadway is already in Piccadilly." End quote. By all that, he meant that the next great heresy would be fueled by economics. And he was right, because he was basing this on what he saw all around him. The roaring 1920s were a decade of decadence, and during periods of decadence, we can plainly see decadent ideas taking hold. One of those was the eugenics movement. Among its champions was the very infamous Margaret Sanger, who called Catholics, people of color, and anyone who wasn't of pure white Protestant stock weeds to be exterminated. I don't mean to suggest that she was a religious woman in the theological sense. Far from it. She did have a religious fervor for her work, fueled as it was by the shifting economic conditions of the day. By the 1940s, the eugenics brand had died off due to the programs of the Nazis in that area, so her American Birth Control League changed its name to the International Planned Parenthood Foundation, which worked tirelessly to repeal anti-contraceptive laws, relax laws against sodomy and adultery, and work to undermine the family and gender roles broadly. If there is a patron demoness of the sexual revolution, it would be Margaret Sanger. Much of her success in promoting the rise of degeneracy was due to timing. In that same 1940s, penicillin helped eradicate syphilis, which served as an incentive against adultery, as it often maimed or killed its victims. While we often think of the 1950s as a decade of traditional family values, that was not true in the slightest for the younger people, who were already beginning to experiment because the main STD that people worried about was no longer a big deal. Enter the pill in the early 1960s, combined with the general air of revolution permeating everything in society, from the family to government to the church, hello Vatican II, and you get the perfect situation for a major cultural disjunction. But even all of that only scratches the surface. The sexual revolution and its undermining of the family also had an economic aspect. The pill and, of course, contraceptive barriers helped create the environment for women to enter the workforce full-time. For those in the broader society only concerned with promoting economic growth with no regards for the common good, the sexual revolution created an environment that directly led to declining birth rates. Now, in the Western world, the average family has fewer than 2.1 children, which is the accepted replacement rate for the native population. This has led to all manner of societal problems, including an immigration crisis promoted by the children and grandchildren of the rootless transnational financial interests who have no concern for society but only for their personal well-being. But blaming economic interests for the plans laid by others that would result in the revolution isn't entirely accurate. Those driven purely by personal economic gain are only opportunists. Academia had long since turned against the family and the church by the 1960s. Intellectuals like Wilhelm Reich promoted sexual revolution in the most revolting of ways. He developed a theory-based name that I have significantly sanitized by renaming it sexual release theory. This theory of his says that for a person to be a well-adjusted human being who is happy, they must achieve sexual release a minimum of 3 times per week. To achieve this, all barriers to that goal must be destroyed, including religion and the family, especially child-rearing. Reich wanted to sexualize the masses, to destroy the relationship between man and God, religious institutions, our elders, everything that would get in the way of promoting further atomization. He never characterized it as a promotion of atomization. In his works on what he called sex pole, he was trying to create paradise on Earth. Yes, you heard that right. Sexual revolution was meant to bring about a utopia. I could go on and on. What is the goal of sexual liberation? It is not liberation. As Dr. E. Michael Jones describes this in many of his controversial talks and in his book Libido Dominandi, the goal of sexual liberation is political control. I'll let Dr. Jones explain this in terms that make this absolutely clear.
So, in order to really understand it, the real dynamics of it, you have to take a step back and you have to look for examples. And I think the best example that I can come up with was the instance of the Intifada, the battle between the Israelis and the Palestinians. In 2002, the Israeli military force marched into Ramallah. And after they did that, they took over the TV stations, which is pretty much standard procedure. But after they did that, something unusual happened.
What was that?
They started broadcasting pornography over the TV stations.
Oh, they're liberating them.
Well, this leads you to a question of, well, why were they doing that? Now, I've mentioned this in talks I've given in Europe and Africa and in the United States. And in 2 of those 3 instances, there were Palestinians in the audience who came up to me and said that they were there when it happened and told me details about it that I didn't know. For example, that there were snipers on the roof of the hospital in town, and they imposed a curfew, and if you went out, you got shot. So you had to stay in the house, and when you stayed in the house, the only source of information you had was the television, and the television is now broadcasting pornography. First one station, and then basically all 3, all the stations but one got taken over, and the one station that didn't get taken over broadcasting, well, there's little bands across the bottom of the screen that they've been taken over by the Israelis, and they're broadcasting pornography. So, this is not something we're doing. We're beyond our control. So the question is, why did they do that? And if you go to the American contemporary culture and you look for an explanation for the purpose or the reason for pornography or what pornography means, there were 2 fairly recent cultural artifacts that explain it for you. The one is called The People versus Larry Flint, Hollywood movie. And the other one was called Boogie Nights. And both of these appeared at around the early 90s, and they appeared at that particular time for a particular reason. That's because at that time Congress was debating something called the Communications Decency Act, which was whether to allow pornography on the Internet. And this was the pornography industry's cultural offensive to make sure that they were allowed to use the internet to distribute pornography. So you go to a movie like The People versus Larry Flint, and Woody Harrelson, for some reason, they picked him to play Larry Flint. I don't know where. I guess Jabba the Hutt was had other obligations at that time. But anyway, they got him to play it, and during the course of the movie, he says that no one is free in this country unless I'm allowed to produce pornography. And so that's pretty much the explanation. Pornography equals freedom. So if we take that explanation and we apply it to what happened in Ramallah, it's pretty clear that the Israelis were trying to bring freedom to the Palestinians.
Well, but your book and your thesis is that that's really just a euphemism for a very sophisticated form of slavery.
Well, I think anybody in his right mind knows that the Israelis are not interested in liberating the Palestinians unless we take liberation in a contemporary cultural sense, and so you have to look someplace else for the explanation. And I'm saying the real explanation can be found in places like the story of Samson and Delilah in the Bible, which is also set in Gaza. So nothing has changed in that regard.
Jones's work often gets maligned because he has no filter when it comes to naming names and naming peoples he believes are behind the ills of modern society. But his point stands. Why would the Israelis broadcast pornography on the television stations in the countries they were waging war against if pornography, a significant element of supposed sexual liberation, was about freedom? Sexual revolution in all of its forms turns the person in on the self, dehumanizes our neighbors, and reduces us to the state of one enslaved to their passions. We see this now in the rise of the incel or involuntary celibate among the young men in the West. The incel is a slur used to describe those young men who cannot find a sexual partner, despite their desire to do so. The fact that celibacy is used as a slur in that way is telling about how deeply sick our culture has become. At the risk of quoting Chesterton too much for one video, quote, "Birth control prevails, as all advertisement prevails, simply because there is money behind it. It is an unexpected complication in capitalism, but the practical effect is that liberty, equality, and fraternity have come to mean plutocracy, publicity, and pornography." End quote. That is the source of sexual liberation. Powerful interests promoting various sources of subversion, including Hollywood films that are increasingly subversive as time goes on, as well as a normalization of fornication in government schools and cheap contraception available almost everywhere with little formal oversight. That is the state of things today. Thankfully, as the articles I spoke about at the start talk about, this state of things cannot last, and signs are pointing to a turn back to something more sane, though to be clear, things are not turning back towards traditional Christian moral norms. We are far from that happening, and that will only happen when the church has itself been liberated from the clutches of the modernists who are trying to promote the spirit of revolution in the church today. They are to be resisted, beginning with prayers. Pray a rosary for the liberation of the church from these kinds of men and women who seek to do fully to the church what has been done to the broader society. At this stage of things, only Christ can cure society. Christ, through his church, that has been restored to moral sanity. Thank you for listening and for your support. For a return to tradition, I'm Anthony Stein. Viva Cristo Rey.